A homeless man, drenched from the pouring rain, enters the Grand Silver Crest Hotel. His tattered clothes and burlap sack contrast starkly with the polished luxury around him. As he walks towards the front desk, he looks up with piercing eyes and calmly declares, "This hotel belongs to me." The staff and guests laugh, dismissing him as a crazy homeless man. Their mocking whispers echo through the lobby, but Elijah's unwavering gaze stops them in their tracks. There's something about him, a quiet, unspoken resolve. Why does he claim the hotel as his? What is he really after? Before watching, let us know where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoy this powerful story. Elijah Carter's story begins in the 1970s, when he was a rising star in the business world. Born to working-class parents, he fought tirelessly to make a name for himself. He worked his way through college and into the world of real estate, where his ambition and sharp mind helped him gain the capital needed to partner with Bennett Kavanaugh, a powerful and well-connected businessman. Together, they set out to build the Silver Crest Hotel, a symbol of luxury and success in the city. Elijah was the visionary, the one who dreamed of creating a space where elegance and inclusivity could coexist. With Bennett's financial backing and connections, they turned the dream into reality. The hotel became an instant success, attracting the city's elite and drawing admiration for its innovation. But success came at a price. Bennett Kavanaugh, despite outwardly supporting Elijah, was quietly envious of his partner's rising stature. Elijah's name appeared in the newspapers, his face in the spotlight. While Bennett lurked in the shadows, the arrangement had worked for a while. But as the years passed, the cracks began to show. Bennett's desire for control led him to a breaking point. In the mid-1980s, Bennett devised a plan to remove Elijah from the picture. He secretly forged financial records, making it look like Elijah had been embezzling from their company. Bennett knew that, in the racially charged climate of the time, no one would believe a successful black man like Elijah could truly be innocent. One night, Elijah was arrested in front of his family, dragged from his home in handcuffs while his wife and daughter watched helplessly. His lawyer, a man he had trusted, was secretly on Bennett's payroll, making sure his defense was weak. The jury convicted him swiftly, and Elijah was sentenced to 15 years in prison for crimes he did not commit. Well behind bars, Elijah lost everything. His wife, unable to cope with the shame of the situation, left him. His daughter, believing the lies, turned away. His reputation, once built with sweat and tears, was erased. The Silver Crest, once the symbol of his dreams, became a reminder of the life he had lost. Elijah's years in prison were marked by suffering, but also by the quiet fire of determination. He knew he was innocent, and he knew that someday he would have the chance to prove it. That chance came after his release, but by then, the Silver Crest was no longer his. The hotel had become a monument to Bennett's creed, and Elijah was nothing more than a forgotten man. But he never gave up. He kept the original deed to the hotel hidden, waiting for the moment when he could return and claim what was rightfully his. Years after his release from prison, Elijah Carter found himself walking the streets of the city that had once known his name. But it wasn't the same city anymore, not for him. The Silver Crest Hotel, once his pride and joy, stood tall on the skyline, its gleaming windows mocking his fall from grace. To the world, Elijah was just another homeless man, forgotten by history. But he knew better. He knew the truth. Elijah's life had been reduced to survival. For the past 3 decades, he had lived on the streets, hiding from the world that had rejected him. His days were spent scrounging for food, and his nights, tucked away in alleys, were filled with memories of a past life he could never reclaim. But his spirit, though battered, had not broken. Inside him burned a quiet, and yielding fire a desire for justice that had never wavered. In the years following his release, Elijah tried, time and again, to reclaim his place in the world. He visited the old lawyers, made calls to former associates, and even tried to reach out to the few remaining friends who had known him back in the day. But each attempt was met with dead ends. The Kavanaugh family, having erased him from all records, had ensured that there was no trace of Elijah Carter left in the city's history. The once promising entrepreneur was now nothing more than a forgotten footnote. Despite this, Elijah kept the most important piece of his life close, the deed to the Silvercrest Hotel. Hidden in the few belongings he still carried in his burlap sack, the faded yellowed paper was more than just a legal document. It was the last connection he had to a life of dignity, to a legacy that had been stolen from him. He knew that one day the right moment would come, and when it did, he would make them pay for what they had taken from him over the years. Elijah had slowly pieced together what had really happened: the lies, the corruption, and the way the Kavanaugh family had manipulated the legal system to bury him. He also came to understand the full depth of Bennett Kavanaugh's cruelty. Not only had Bennett stolen his hotel and his future, but he had also orchestrated the unraveling of Elijah's life. His wife's tragic departure wasn't just a result of the pressure. It was the culmination of years of manipulation and threats. She had been forced to believe the worst of him, and it had torn their family apart. Still, Elijah never gave up. He lived in the shadows, knowing that one day he would return to the Silvercrest not as a homeless man, but as its rightful owner, ready to reclaim what was stolen and expose the truth for all to see. The rain fell relentlessly, turning the streets slick and cold as Elijah Carter walked toward the Silvercrest Hotel. He felt every drop on his skin, but he was undeterred. The familiar sight of the hotel loomed in the distance, its grand facade shining like a beacon of all that he had lost. He could almost hear the echoes of laughter and voices from the past, the sounds of a world where he had once been respected, even admired. He had walked past this building countless times, but today he was not just a ghost from the past. Today, he had come to claim what was his. He pulled the warm burlap sack over his shoulder tightly, as if to protect the single, crumbled piece of paper inside it, the deed to the Silvercrest. It was the only thing he had left from the life he once had, the only thing that proved he was not a thief or a fraud. It was his proof, his truth. The hotel's grand entrance loomed before him, the massive oak doors a symbolic barrier between the past and present. As he pushed open the doors, the sound of rain pounding against the marble floors was immediately drowned by the chatter and clinking of glasses from well-dressed guests sipping champagne in the lobby. The warmth inside was a sharp contrast to the cold, wet world outside. But Elijah stood still for a moment, letting the reality of it all wash over him. Security, stationed near the door, immediately tensed. The contrast between the elegant guests and Elijah, soaked to the bone in his tattered clothes, was jarring. He walked in without hesitation, every step deliberate, every motion filled with quiet dignity. His worn boots left puddles on the pristine marble, but he didn't seem to notice or care. "Excuse me, sir," called out the front desk clerk, a young woman with perfectly styled hair. Her tone was polite but tight, as if she was trying to mask her discomfort. "You can't be in here." Elijah didn't respond. He didn't flinch or even glance at her. His eyes were scanning the lobby, taking in the luxurious surroundings. But there was no awe in them. He wasn't here to admire the decor. He was here to take back what was rightfully his. The hotel manager, Mr. Langley, a man in his 50s with a tailored suit and a look of perpetual superiority, stepped out from behind the desk. He took in Elijah's appearance with a slight, dismissive smile, the kind of smile reserved for those who are not worthy of his time. "Is there a problem here?" Langley asked. His voice dripping with condescension, Elijah turned to face him, his gaze unwavering. "No problem at all," he said, his voice calm but deep, carrying a quiet strength that seemed to resonate throughout the room. "I'm here to claim what's mine." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, but Langley only chuckled, as did a few of the guests nearby. They glanced at each other, their laughter spreading like wildfire. "That's a new one," Langley said, his tone amused. "Usually, the homeless ask for spare change." Not the entire building. The guests, clearly enjoying the spectacle, joined in the laughter. Elijah remained silent, unmoved by the ridicule, his eyes still fixed on Langley. He pulled the deed from his sack, holding it out calmly. "Check your records," he said simply. Langley's smile faltered for a moment as he snatched the paper from Elijah's hand. He glanced at it briefly, then let out a loud laugh. "You must be joking," Langley said, his voice dripping with disdain. "A man like you could never own a place like this." Elijah didn't flinch. He simply stood there, waiting. It wasn't the first time he had been mocked, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, it would be different. This time, he wasn't leaving until the truth was known. Langley waved a hand dismissively, signaling to the security guard, who quickly approached. "Show this gentleman the door," Langley ordered. The security guard, a burly man named Bradley, stepped forward, his hands moving to grab Elijah's arm. "Come on, old-timer," Bradley said, his voice laced with mock kindness. "We don't do handouts here." Elijah didn't resist. He didn't fight back. Instead, he reached into his sack once again. But this time, it wasn't a piece of paper he was pulling out, it was the truth. The security guard, Bradley, moved closer, his hands grabbing at Elijah's arm with more force than necessary. "Let's go," Bradley grunted, trying to pull Elijah toward the door. The guests in the lobby barely looked up, too absorbed in their champagne and whispered conversations. The laughter had died down, but the judgment was still palpable. Elijah didn't struggle. He let Bradley guide him toward the door, his worn boots dragging slightly against the polished floor. It was as if they were pulling him away from a part of his past he had never been able to forget. For a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind, but it was quickly replaced by the same quiet resolve that had sustained him all these years. As they reached the entrance, Elijah's eyes remained focused on Langley, who stood just inside the lobby, arms crossed, still smiling smugly. "You'll regret this," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the rain soaking his clothes. There was no bitterness in his tone, just a quiet certainty. Langley's smirk widened. "I don't think so, old man. You should have stayed out in the street where you belong." His words were venomous, laced with the kind of elitism that had become all too familiar to Elijah in his years of exile. The door swung open, and the gust of wind and rain that followed felt like a slap. Elijah stumbled slightly, but he caught himself, his hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. For a moment, he just stood there, the cold rain splashing against his face, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of all the years he'd spent fighting for justice felt heavy, suffocating. But in that instant, something inside him hardened. Something he hadn't realized was still there. The fire that had once driven him to build the Silver Crest was still burning. Enough. Elijah muttered to himself. He straightened, wiped the rain from his eyes, and turned back to face Langley. Langley's face twisted with amusement as he moved to close the door. But just before it shut, Elijah's voice rang out again. "You laughed," Elijah said, his voice cutting through the sound of the storm, steady and full of purpose. "But you won't be laughing for long." For a moment, Langley hesitated, an uncomfortable shift in his demeanor. He wasn't sure if it was the finality in Elijah's words or the strain. determined energy radiating from the man standing in the rain. But before he could respond, Elijah turned away, his gait deliberate, each step calculated. He walked away from the Silver Crest. But this time, the weight of the rain on his shoulders didn't feel as heavy. The next chapter had begun. Elijah knew that, for the first time in years, the truth was no longer a secret buried beneath years of deceit. It was in the open now, even if no one else understood it yet. As he disappeared into the storm, he knew that he had set something in motion, a chain of events that would unravel the lies of the Kavanaghs and bring the Silver Crest back to its rightful owner. It wasn't the end. It was only the beginning, and no amount of mockery or dismissal could stop what was coming next. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider joining us by hitting the subscribe button. There's so much more to come. Amanda Williams couldn't shake the image of the homeless man she had seen just hours before. Elijah Carter, the man who claimed the Silver Crest Hotel was his, was not the delusional character that Mr. Langley and the guests had mocked. There was something about his presence, the quiet intensity in his eyes, that lingered in her mind. She had worked at the Silver Crest long enough to recognize the dynamics of power and wealth. But Elijah's appearance didn't fit any of the typical stories she had heard. Something about him felt different. As she sat behind her desk that afternoon, sorting through reservation forms, she couldn't focus. The sight of Elijah, drenched, determined, yet dignified, kept replaying in her mind. She had to know more. There was more to this story, and she was determined to uncover it. After finishing her shift, Amanda decided to dig deeper. The Silver Crest had seen countless transactions over the years, but she had never questioned the history of the hotel before. Like most of the staff, she accepted the Kavanaugh legacy without ever considering the people or events that had built it. Elijah's claim had shaken her, and for the first time, she felt the need to understand what lay beneath the surface. She started in the hotel's old filing cabinet records that had been forgotten by the digital age. Pulling open the heavy drawer, Amanda found old documents, newspaper clippings, and photographs dating back to the 1970s. The dates and names were familiar. Bennett Kavanaugh, the legendary figure who had built the Silver Crest. But one name kept reappearing alongside Bennett's: Elijah Carter. In a dusty folder labeled Hotel Founding, Amanda uncovered a photograph from the groundbreaking ceremony of the Silver Crest. Bennett Kavanaugh was smiling proudly at the front of the group, shaking hands with local dignitaries. But standing beside him was another man, Elijah Carter. He looked much younger, his eyes alight with ambition and hope. A photo from a moment long past, when Elijah and Bennett had worked together side by side to build what would become a symbol of luxury. As Amanda flipped through the files, she found more documents linking Elijah to the hotel's early success. There were legal papers showing that Elijah had contributed substantial investments and resources to the project. His name was listed as the co-owner, alongside Bennett. But as Amanda continued to scan the records, a chilling realization began to form. Elijah's name began to disappear from the documents after 1987. From that point forward, only Bennett Kavanaugh was listed as the sole owner of the Silver Crest. The trail went cold, and there were no records of Elijah in the years that followed. What had happened to him? Why had his name been erased from the history of the very place he helped create? Amanda's mind raced as she pieced together the story. She found references to an embezzlement scandal in the late 1980s. The story was vague, but it suggested that Elijah had been accused of financial mismanagement. The accusations were severe: embezzlement, fraud, even theft from the very company he had helped build. But there were no details, no clear explanation of how this had unfolded. All she could see was the aftermath: Elijah, convicted, imprisoned, and erased from every record. Bennett Kavanaugh, on the other hand, stood tall, his family's empire growing stronger. Amanda's heart sank as she began to piece together the pieces of the puzzle. Elijah had been betrayed, His name had been tarnished in the public eye, his reputation destroyed, and all of it had been orchestrated by Bennett Kavanaugh. Elijah had been framed, falsely accused, and silenced for something he never did. The realization hit Amanda like a wave. This was more than just a case of wrongful accusations. It was a calculated move by Bennett to take everything from Elijah. His wealth, his family, and his legacy. And now, Elijah was back to reclaim what was his daughter. Amanda felt a deep sense of empathy for Elijah. What had he gone through? The betrayal, the loss of everything he had worked for. The years spent in prison while the world forgot his name. She could no longer stand by and do nothing. She knew she had to help him, to uncover the truth, and bring justice to a man who had been wronged by those with power and money. With the documents spread before her, Amanda's resolve hardened. She wasn't just working for the hotel anymore. She was working to undo the wrongs of the past, to give Elijah the justice he had been denied for far too long. She couldn't do it alone, but she knew the first step was to find Elijah again and let him know what she had discovered. As she gathered the papers, Amanda glanced at the old photograph of Elijah, standing proudly beside Bennett Kavanaugh. He had once been a man of strength, of dignity, and now he was about to take back what was rightfully his. She had to stand by him, no matter the cost. The battle for the Silver Crest and for Elijah's legacy had only just begun. As Amanda dug deeper into the history of the Silver Crest Hotel, the more she unearthed a web of corruption that made her stomach churn. The documents and records she found were nothing like the polished, sanitized version of history she had been taught at the hotel. They were raw, unfiltered pieces of the past, pieces that had been swept under the rug, hidden in dark corners where no one could see. And the deeper she went, the more she began to realize that Elijah's story was far from unique. It was part of a much larger pattern. Amanda's mind raced as she sifted through the pages of old property records, financial statements, and legal documents. She discovered that Bennett Kavanaugh, a name once synonymous with wealth and power, had a long history of exploiting those around him. It wasn't just Elijah who had suffered. Bennett had systematically taken advantage of countless people in the city, particularly people of color, using manipulation, deceit, and sheer force to acquire their businesses, homes, and properties. All the while, he had kept his hands clean, his reputation untarnished. While others paid the price, one particular document caught Amanda's attention. It was a series of confidential financial reports from the 1970s and 1980s, detailing how Bennett Kavanaugh had used illegal means to take control of all properties throughout the city. The records were vague, but there was enough there to show that he had used falsified documents to transfer ownership of the Silver Crest from Elijah to himself, effectively erasing Elijah from the history of the hotel. As Amanda read through the reports, she discovered something even more disturbing: the extent of the cover-up. Kavanaugh had bribed officials, coerced witnesses, and manipulated the legal system to ensure that Elijah's name was erased from every record. He had framed Elijah for crimes he didn't commit, knowing that the courts, swayed by racial prejudice, would believe the worst of a black businessman in a predominantly white city. It was a harsh reality that Amanda had never fully understood before. She had always known that the Kavanaughs were wealthy, influential, and well-connected, but she had never realized the extent of their corruption. Elijah's downfall wasn't a mere accident. It was a deliberate, calculated effort to destroy a man who had once been his equal, a man who had dared to dream as big as he had. But it wasn't just the past that troubled Amanda. The more she uncovered, the more she began to suspect that the Kavanaughs weren't done. The way they had erased Elijah from the history of the Silver Crest was not just about power. It was about control. The Kavanaughs weren't content with wealth and status. They wanted to ensure that no one, no matter how deserving, could ever threaten their empire. and the more Amanda learned about their methods, the more she realized that Elijah was far from the only person they had wronged. Her suspicions deepened when she found a hidden memo among the papers. It was a note from a lawyer who had been working for the Kavanaughs during the 1980s, detailing how they had used Elijah's wrongful conviction to further their own interests. The memo made it clear that the Kavanaughs had known Elijah was innocent all along. They had engineered the entire scandal to rid themselves of him, to solidify their control over the Silver Crest and every other property they had acquired through illegal means. The gravity of the situation hit Amanda like a ton of bricks. Elijah had not just been robbed of his hotel, he had been systematically erased from the history of the city, and worse. His life had been destroyed by a powerful family who used their wealth and influence to maintain their stranglehold over everything they touched. The injustice was staggering, and Amanda realized with a growing sense of urgency that she had to do something. She couldn't just stand by while the Kavanaughs continued their reign of deception. As Amanda began to piece together the story, she felt a deep sense of responsibility for the truth. She couldn't allow this corruption to continue, not when there was a chance to right the wrongs of the past. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. She had already reached out to Elijah. But now, she needed to bring others into the fold, people who could help her expose the Kavanaughs for who they truly were. The more Amanda learned, the more determined she became. She knew she had to act quickly before the Kavanaughs realized what she was doing. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of lies and deception. But she was determined to bring it to the surface. Elijah's claim wasn't just about a hotel, it was about justice, about reclaiming everything that had been stolen from him. And now, it was time to take action. Amanda sat back in her chair, the weight of the documents heavy in her hands. She had uncovered the truth. But the real battle was only just beginning. The Kavanaughs had tried to bury Elijah, but Amanda was ready to help him rise again, and this time, they weren't be able to hide the truth. Not anymore. Amanda's discovery of the Kavanaughs' corruption had only fueled her resolve. She had uncovered enough to know that Elijah's fight for justice was far from over. She knew the Kavanaughs had used every trick in the book to maintain their grip on power. But the real depth of their machinations was far worse than she had anticipated. As the evidence piled up, Amanda realized that the Silver Crest Hotel was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a web of lies, deceit, and financial manipulation that stretched across the city and beyond. The more Amanda investigated, the more she uncovered. Bennett Kavanaugh had not just stolen the Silver Crest from Elijah, he had built his empire on a foundation of stolen dreams, properties. Businesses and even entire neighborhoods had been systematically taken from people, particularly from the marginalized communities in the city. The Kavanaughs had used the legal system to dispossess families, often forcing them to sell their properties for pennies on the dollar or driving them to bankruptcy through inflated loans and fraudulent contracts for decades. Bennett had used his wealth to buy influence and silence anyone who dared to challenge him. Amanda was now painfully aware that the battle Elijah was fighting wasn't just about a hotel, it was about a system of corruption that had kept the city's most vulnerable people trapped in poverty. While the Kavanaughs thrived, every time she uncovered a new piece of evidence, she felt the weight of the injustice that had been done, not just to Elijah, but to so many others. The Kavanaughs had built their empire on the backs of the city's poorest, taking advantage of the legal loopholes and social inequalities that kept people like Elijah and his community from ever having a chance to fight back. As Amanda gathered more documents, she realized just how deeply embedded the Kavanaughs were in the city's power structure. They had bought off politicians, bribed law enforcement, and had their fingers in nearly every major industry. Even the local media had been complicit, with several journalists on the Kavanaugh payroll, writing glowing stories about the family's business practices while ignoring or burying the allegations of corruption and theft that had followed them for years. The city had turned a blind eye to the truth. allowing the Kavanaghs to operate unchecked and without consequence. But the deeper Amanda delved, the more dangerous her search became. One night, as she sat in her small apartment, poring over the records she had found, she received an anonymous message on her phone. It was simple. "Stop looking into this. It's bigger than you think." The message came with no sender, no identifying information, just a chilling warning. Amanda stared at the screen, her heart racing. She knew this wasn't just a threat, it was a message from someone who had a stake in keeping the truth hidden. The Kavanaghs were onto her. She had no doubt about it. The phone call from Diego, the young hotel employee she had been working with, only confirmed her fears. Diego had gone quiet after his last few texts, and Amanda's instincts told her something was wrong. She tried calling him several times, but the calls went straight to voicemail. When she contacted one of his co-workers, she was told that Diego hadn't shown up for work that day and hadn't called in. The feeling of dread deepened as she realized that Diego had likely been silenced. Was he in danger? Had he discovered something the Kavanaghs didn't want anyone to know? Amanda knew she couldn't back down now. She couldn't let fear stop her from exposing the truth. Elijah's life was on the line, and so were countless others who had been victimized by the Kavanaugh family. She had come this far, and there was no turning back. In the coming days, Amanda's investigation became more urgent. She couldn't do it alone anymore. She reached out to Frank Banks, the investigative journalist she had read about in the Newsman, who had made a name for himself exposing corporate fraud and political corruption. He had been chasing the Kavanaghs for years, but had never been able to get close enough to unravel their secrets. Frank was skeptical at first, but when Amanda shared the documents she had uncovered, he was taken aback by the sheer scale of the Kavanaghs' operation. He agreed to help, and together, they began building a case that could bring the family down. Amanda also sought out Carl, the hotel janitor who had worked at the Silver Crest for decades. Carl was a quiet, observant man who had seen the rise and fall of many employees, and he had always been suspicious of the Kavanaghs. When Amanda approached him with her findings, Carl's eyes widened with recognition. He had known Elijah back in the 1970s when the hotel was first built. He was one of the few who remembered the man Elijah had been before the scandal, and he could see the injustice that had been done to him. Carl agreed to help, providing Amanda with access to more confidential records and giving her crucial information about the inner workings of the hotel. He was a valuable ally, and together with Frank, Amanda began to put the pieces together. They found a detailed ledger in the hotel's basement, a record of every illegal transaction and bribe the Kavanaghs had made over the years. It was a damning document that could expose the full extent of their corruption. But the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous their investigation became. One evening, as Amanda returned to her apartment, she noticed something off. The door to her apartment was slightly ajar, and the faintest hint of movement from within caught her attention. Her heart pounded as she entered cautiously, finding the place ransacked, drawers pulled out, papers scattered across the floor. Someone had been looking for something, and just as quickly as she had entered, Amanda's phone buzzed. It was a message from Diego. They know, don't trust anyone, but by the time she tried to call him, his phone went dead. Panic set in. Diego had gone missing, and now Amanda was on her own, facing a powerful, dangerous family that would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. She didn't know who to trust anymore. But one thing was certain: the Kavanaghs would do anything to maintain their control, and it was up to her, Frank, and Carl to expose them before it was too late. The conspiracy was deeper than she had ever imagined, and the stakes were higher than she had thought possible. But she couldn't stop now. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The tension had been building for days, but the final betrayal hit Amanda like a bolt of lightning. She had trusted Diego. He had been a key player in their efforts to expose the Kavanaugh family, helping her gather evidence, running errands, and even providing her with inside information about the Silver Crest's operations. But now, as she stood in the quiet of her apartment, sifting through the scattered papers, the truth hit her hard. Diego had been playing both sides. It had been Frank's call that tipped Amanda off. He'd been in contact with his sources, trying to corroborate the documents they had uncovered. That's when Frank found a startling piece of information. There was a communication trail linking Diego to the Kavanaugh's encrypted emails, subtle clues, and even surveillance footage from the hotel's security system. Amanda's heart sank as she realized the young man she had trusted had been feeding information to the Kavanaughs all along. He was part of the very system they had been trying to bring down. Why? Amanda whispered to herself, staring at the mess in her apartment. The piles of papers, the files she'd spent sleepless nights poring over. All the work she had done to expose the Kavanaughs seemed wasted now. She had let Diego into her trust, into her investigation, and he had betrayed them all. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from Diego. The message was simple. I didn't have a choice. Amanda clenched her fists, fury bubbling up inside her. She had to confront him, to understand why he had done this, but she knew that any attempt to reach out might be futile now. Diego had become a pawn in a much larger game, and now, like so many others before him, he had sold out to protect his own interests. Amanda couldn't afford to dwell on the betrayal, not when the stakes were this high. The Kavanaughs were closing in, and they knew too much about her now. It was time to take drastic action. Amanda made the difficult decision to meet Carl, Frank, and Elijah. She knew she couldn't do this alone anymore. They had to finish what they had started before it was too late. They had the evidence. They had the truth. But they needed a plan to expose it to the world. The Kavanaughs had the power to silence anyone who opposed them, but with Carl's knowledge of the hotel's inner workings, Frank's investigative skills, and Elijah's resolve, they had the tools to fight back. It was a risky move, but it was the only one they had left. Amanda arranged a meeting with Carl and Frank in a safe location, an old diner on the outskirts of town where they wouldn't be watched. She didn't trust the usual methods of communication anymore. Every text, every phone call was a potential trap, and the Kavanaughs had proven time and again that they were capable of anything to keep their empire intact. Carl arrived first, his weary face betraying the burden he carried. Elijah had already started to prepare, Carl said, and they would meet him shortly. Frank was running a little behind, but Amanda didn't mind the wait. She needed a moment to gather her thoughts. Her mind was clouded with everything she had learned, the corruption, the lies, the manipulation. She had been so focused on uncovering the truth that she hadn't allowed herself to process the personal toll this had taken on her. You look like you've seen a ghost, Carl said softly as he slid into the booth across from Amanda. His voice had a quiet strength, the kind that only came from years of experience, of having seen more than his fair share of the world's darker side. Amanda looked up at him, her eyes tired but determined. Diego betrayed us. He's been working for them the entire time. Carl didn't seem surprised. They've got everyone in their pocket. Amanda, they're not just after Elijah. They've been taking down people like him for years, using fear and money to keep anyone from speaking up. Diego is just another casualty of that system. It's hard to fight against it when the odds are so stacked against you. Amanda took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. We can't back down now, Carl. Not after everything we've learned. Not after everything Elijah's been through. Carl nodded. You're right. But we have to be smart. The Kavanaughs aren't just going to fold. We're going to need something more than just the truth to bring them down. We need to hit them where it hurts. Frank arrived soon after, his face grim. He wasted no time in getting to the point. I've been looking into the Kavanaugh's ties to local officials, their dealings with banks, their influence over the media. We've got a story something big, but it's not enough to just put it out there. We need people to listen. We need to expose the entire system they've built. We've got Elijah, Amanda said, turning to Frank, and I've found a way to get the evidence into the hands of the right people. We just need to keep pushing. Elijah had been working on his own. Gathering the final pieces of the puzzle, the group met up later that night, huddled around a small table at Carl's place, the tension in the air thick. Elijah's face was more weathered than usual, the years of hardship etched into every line. But his eyes were still sharp, full of fire. "We've got one shot at this," Elijah said, his voice steady and low. "If we fail, they'll bury us, just like they buried my name. But we can't let them win. Not again." The plan was set. They would release the evidence documents, witness testimonies, and everything they had learned about the Kavanaugh's illegal activities through a secure news outlet. The world needed to know the truth, not just about Elijah's stolen legacy, but about the extent of the Kavanaugh family's corruption. But even as they put their plan into motion, Amanda knew the risks. They would have to face the Kavanaughs head-on, and the fight ahead was sure to be dangerous. Elijah's resolve had hardened over the years, and now it burned brighter than ever. This wasn't just about reclaiming a hotel. This was about exposing the system, breaking the cycle of injustice, and making sure that the people who had been silenced for so long were finally heard. But the question was, would the world be ready for the truth? Amanda couldn't afford to think about that now. She had a battle to fight, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was on the right side of history. Elijah deserves a like for his unwavering determination. But sadly, he hasn't received one yet. The Silver Crest Hotel was buzzing with excitement, its elegant ballroom filled with the city's elite, all gathered for the annual gala hosted by Jonathan Kavanaugh. It was the highlight of the social calendar, a night of luxury, champagne, and self-congratulation. The Kavanaughs were at the top of their game. As they had always been, the gleaming chandeliers reflected the wealth and power that had been built on the backs of others. The air was thick with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of social climbing. But beneath the surface, there was a tension growing. Amanda had been at the Silver Crest for hours, blending in with the crowd, pretending to be just another guest at the gala. She had traded her usual reception attire for a stunning gown, a calculated choice to help her blend into the opulent surroundings. But underneath the glamour, her mind was focused on one thing: bringing down the Kavanaugh family. She and Elijah had spent the last few days preparing for this moment. They knew the Kavanaughs wouldn't go down without a fight. But this night was their opportunity to expose everything. Amanda had spent hours working with Frank Banks, the investigative journalist who had agreed to help them together. They had secured the release of the documents, financial records, testimony, and eyewitness accounts that would expose the Kavanaughs' long history of corruption and exploitation. But they couldn't just hand the documents over. They had to do it in front of the right audience: the press, politicians, and the powerful guests attending the gala. It was time for the truth to be known. The evening unfolded as expected. Jonathan Kavanaugh, ever the showman, made his entrance. His tailored tuxedo and injured arm were the talk of the room. A minor accident, he had claimed, the result of a small mishap at home. He was charismatic, commanding attention the moment he stepped into the room, raising a glass and offering a well-rehearsed speech about family values, legacy, and the great achievements of the Kavanaugh dynasty. The crowd applauded, hanging on every word. But Amanda, standing at the back of the room with Elijah, could feel the growing weight of the moment. Elijah, dressed in a sharp tuxedo, looked every bit the man he once was, the man who had helped build this very hotel. His eyes, however, were not on the festivities. He was watching Jonathan, his former partner turned adversary. With a quiet fury that simmered just below the surface, Elijah had waited a long time for this. For years, he had lived in the shadows, watching the Kavanaughs profit from his hard work. He had been erased from history, his name removed from the records of the hotel he had helped create. But tonight, in front of the most influential people in the city, Elijah Carter would reclaim what was his. He would expose the Kavanaughs for the corrupt empire they were, and nothing would stop him. As the speeches continued and the night wore on, Amanda's eyes darted nervously around the room, keeping an eye on the guests and waiting for the right moment. She had already contacted Carl, who was on standby. Frank was nearby, ready to release the documents to the press at a moment's notice. Elijah's plan was simple: confront Jonathan publicly, force him to face the truth, and make sure the world was watching. When the Kavanaugh's empire crumbled, the moment arrived sooner than expected. A voice interrupted Jonathan's speech, a familiar voice that cut through the room like a knife. Frank Banks, standing near the bar, raised a tablet high for all to see. A legacy built on stolen dreams and falsified documents, Frank declared, his voice carrying across the ballroom. The room fell silent. People turned, their expression shifting from curiosity to confusion, then disbelief. Jonathan froze for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he searched for the source of the disruption. "Mr. Banks, always a pleasure," Jonathan said, forcing a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "But I think you've had enough to drink tonight. Perhaps we should save your creative interpretations for another time." But Frank didn't back down. "This is not interpretation, Jonathan," he said, holding up the tablet for everyone to see. "This is documentation, proof of the corruption that's been hidden for decades." Jonathan's face paled as the crowd round him began to murmur. The guests were pulling out their phones, checking the news, their expressions changing from polite curiosity to shock. The documents Frank had exposed, combined with the digital images of the financial records, were already making their rounds online. The evidence was clear, irrefutable proof of the Kavanaugh family's criminal actions, their fraudulent dealings, and their manipulation of the legal system. Amanda could feel her heart pounding in her chest. This was at the tipping point. The truth was out, and the world was watching. But Jonathan wasn't finished. His smile faded, and he stepped forward, his voice laced with barely concealed rage. "I don't know what kind of stunt you think this is, but it's not going to work. You don't have a leg to stand on. A homeless man and a reporter against the Kavanaugh family. You really think anyone will believe you?" But before Jonathan could go any further, Elijah stepped into the spotlight, moving toward him with purpose. His voice, calm and steady, cut through the tension in the room. "You're wrong, Jonathan. You've spent decades lying, manipulating, and stealing from people. You may have erased my name from the records, but you cannot erase the truth. I was there at the beginning, and I'll be here at the end." The guests in the ballroom shifted uncomfortably, some beginning to realize the depth of the scandal unfolding before them. The security guards, who had been watching the scene with increasing concern, began to move toward Elijah and Frank. But they hesitated. The room was filling with whispers, and there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. "You can't do this, Elijah," Jonathan sneered, but his words were laced with panic. "You think the media, the public, will believe your lies over the Kavanaugh name? I don't need to make them believe me, Jonathan," Elijah said, his voice firm. "The truth speaks for itself. The truth is in the documents. The truth is in the history you tried to bury." As Elijah spoke, Amanda's phone buzzed in her pocket. She quickly checked the message. It was from Frank. The documents were spreading like wildfire. News outlets were picking up the story, and a live feed of the gala was already making its way onto major news networks. The Kavanagh's carefully curated reputation was crumbling right before their eyes. Jonathan's confidence faltered, but it was too late. The damage had been done. A hush fell over the room as the magnitude of the situation settled in. The Kavanaghs, for all their wealth and influence, were facing their reckoning. The story of Elijah Carter, the man they had tried to destroy, was now the story of the night. Amanda stood by Elijah, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. The battle wasn't over. But this moment was a turning point. As the Kavanagh's empire began to unravel, Amanda knew that they had achieved something monumental. Elijah had faced years of oppression and injustice, but now he was standing in the light and with the truth on his side. He was more powerful than the Kavanaghs had ever realized. The silver crest, once a symbol of the Kavanaghs' stolen legacy, was now the backdrop for a new chapter, one where the truth would prevail, no matter the cost. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah Carter allowed himself a brief moment of hope. His fight wasn't over, but the future looked brighter than it had in decades. The chaos in the Silver Crest ballroom was palpable. The murmurs among the guests grew louder, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Jonathan Kavanagh, once a proud, powerful man, stood at the center of it all, struggling to maintain his composure. His suit, impeccable just hours ago, now felt like the shroud of a man whose empire was crumbling round him. As Elijah Carter's words echoed in the room, the truth began to sink in. The Kavanaugh dynasty had been built on lies, deception, and exploitation, and now everyone could see it. Jonathan tried to regain control, but his voice trembled as he spoke. "This is absurd. This is nothing more than a smear campaign. You will never be able to prove any of this." His words faltered, a desperate attempt to rally his shrinking confidence. But the damage was already done. The guests, once loyal to the Kavanaugh name, began to turn away from Jonathan, murmuring amongst themselves. Some had already taken to their phones, checking the breaking news, the articles and videos that were flooding the internet. The very foundations of the Kavanaugh empire were exposed, and no amount of charisma or money could make it disappear. Amanda stood by Elijah's side, feeling a surge of adrenaline. She had known this moment would come, the moment when the truth would have to face the light of day, but seeing it unfold, the Kavanaghs scrambling to hold on to their wealth and influence while the world watched, felt like something out of a dream. The struggle was far from over, but for the first time, it seemed possible that they could win. Frank Banks, standing at the bar, was speaking with a group of journalists, passing round the tablet that had exposed the documents. His voice was calm but urgent. "This is the beginning of the end for them. We've got the proof, the witnesses, and now we've got the press on our side." As the journalists quickly uploaded the story, others began to speak up, adding their own revelations to the growing list of accusations. It wasn't just Elijah's story anymore. It was the story of countless families who had been displaced, whose lives had been ruined by the Kavanagh's underhanded dealings. Slowly but surely, the pieces of the puzzle started to come together, and the public began to grasp the full extent of the Kavanagh's corruption. But while the press and the guests turned their attention to the unfolding scandal, Jonathan was not about to go down without a fight. His eyes flicked to the side, where his security team had started to approach, clearly instructed to remove Elijah and his allies. But the guards, unsure of what to do in the face of growing public attention, hesitated. They were no longer just dealing with a disgraced man, they were facing the entire city, the truth, and the media's prying eyes. As the security guards stalled, Elijah stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. His voice cut through the room once more. "You can try to silence me, Jonathan. You've done it before, but you can't silence the truth. Not anymore." Jonathan's hand clenched into a fist, his face red with anger. "I'll make sure you regret this," he spat, his words thick with malice. You've made a mistake you'll never live to see the end of." Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't back down. "You're the one who made the mistake, Jonathan, and it's one you'll have to answer for." The room had gone quiet. Every eye was on Jonathan, and the pressure was building. The once confident man who had been the architect of his family's empire now seemed small and desperate. Standing in front of a room full of people who were beginning to understand the extent of his corruption, his face twisted in anger. But he was trapped. There was no escape now. The truth had already spread too far. Amanda looked round the room, watching as people turned away from Jonathan, no longer willing to support him, no longer willing to be associated with his name. She couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, but it was mixed with something deeper. The fight was not over. The Kavanaghs still had power, still had resources, and they wouldn't go down without a final push. But they had been exposed, and the world would be watching every step of their downfall. As the gala spiraled into confusion, Amanda quickly scanned the room for Carl. He had been working quietly in the background, helping Elijah navigate the political and legal challenges of reclaiming his rightful place. But tonight, he was needed more than ever. Carl was the key to ensuring that the story wasn't just another scandal that would fade into memory. He had connections, knowledge, and the inside information that could ensure the Kavanaghs were held accountable for their actions. Amanda found Carl standing near the exit, watching the chaos unfold with a mixture of concern and determination. "We need to act fast," Amanda said, walking toward him. "We've got the documents, we've got the press, but we need to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Carl nodded gravely. "I've already made some calls. The DAS office is aware of the situation. The FBI has been investigating the Kavanaghs for a while, but now they've got everything they need to move forward. It's time to make sure they don't get away with it." Amanda's heart raced. She had been so focused on the immediate confrontation with Jonathan that she hadn't fully considered the long-term implications of their actions. But now, with the truth out in the open, it was time to make sure the Kavanaghs couldn't escape justice. This wasn't just about taking back the Silver Crest, it was about making sure that everything they had stolen, from Elijah and countless others, would be returned. As the night wore on, the Silver Crest became the backdrop for the beginning of a long, public battle. Amanda, Elijah, Cole, and Frank all played their parts in ensuring that the evidence was presented to the authorities. The media, now fully invested in the scandal, helped to keep the pressure on. By the end of the night, Jonathan Kavanagh had been escorted out of the building by law enforcement. His face was pale, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. His empire, built on stolen land, false accusations, and corruption, was collapsing, piece by piece. But even in the midst of his defeat, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The road to true justice was still long, and the Kavanaghs weren't the only family with secrets to hide. But for the first time in decades, Elijah stood tall, no longer a forgotten man, but a symbol of resistance, of survival, and of the truth finally coming to light. The Silver Crest, the hotel he had built, was no longer a monument to the Kavanaghs. It was a testament to the power of justice. No matter how long it takes to arrive. As the crowd dispersed, Amanda and Elijah stood together, watching the world they had fought for begin to change. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, they felt a sense of hope. They had uncovered the truth, and now they would make sure it was heard. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The Kavanaghs' reign was coming to an end. The fallout from the gala was immediate. The Silver Crest Hotel, once a beacon of luxury and power, had become ground zero for a scandal that would shake the city to its core. The media coverage exploded, with news outlets scrambling to report on the Kavanagh family's decades of corruption, fraud, and abuse. Headlines screamed about the Kavanaughs' ties to local politicians, their manipulation of the legal system, and their systematic dispossession of minority business owners. The once untouchable Kavanaugh empire was being torn apart, piece by piece, as investigations ramped up and the truth spread across the country. For Elijah Carter, the reality of the situation was bittersweet. His years of struggle, of survival on the streets, had led him to this moment, the moment when he would finally be vindicated. Yet, as the media storm raged around the Kavanaughs, he couldn't shake the feeling of loss. The hotel, the business he had once envisioned as a symbol of his success, had been turned into a battleground. The memories of the betrayal, the wrongful imprisonment, and the years of solitude weighed heavily on his heart. He had won, yes, but the scars of the past were still fresh, and they would take time to heal. Daughter Amanda Williams, ever by his side, was starting to feel the weight of everything they had uncovered. She had been instrumental in bringing the Kavanaughs to justice. But now, with the hotel and its legacy in turmoil, she wasn't sure where they stood. The Kavanaughs had spent decades building their wealth on lies, and now, with Jonathan Kavanaugh's arrest and the investigation into his family's dealings, the question remained: what would become of the Silver Crest as the days passed? Amanda couldn't ignore the nagging thought that this victory, while monumental, might not bring the closure they were hoping for. The Kavanaughs were wealthy, powerful, and connected. Even with the public outcry and the media's attention, Amanda knew that their influence wasn't easily eradicated. The fight for justice had only begun. The city was alive with discussions, protests, and debates over the Kavanaughs' corruption. People from all walks of life were coming forward, sharing their stories of how they had been wronged by the Kavanaughs. Some had lost their homes to illegal property seizures. Others had been forced out of businesses that their families had built for generations. The Silver Crest was now a symbol of the power that could be wielded by those with money, a reminder of the people who had suffered under the Kavanaughs' rule. But it was also a symbol of hope. Elijah's story had resonated with the city's marginalized communities, who had long believed that the powerful could never be held accountable. Elijah was no longer just a former business partner. He had become the voice of those who had been silenced, of those who had been wronged, but never had the power to fight back. As the public rallied behind him, Amanda saw how much his return meant not just to him, but to the city as a whole. Elijah was proving that even the most deeply entrenched powers could be brought down. As Elijah walked through the Silver Crest's lobby, now swarming with journalists and activists, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in such a short amount of time. Once, this place had represented his downfall. Now, it represented the turning point in his long fight for justice. The hotel had been a symbol of the Kavanaughs' oppression. But with every inch of the story being revealed, it was slowly becoming a space for the people. Amanda had worked tirelessly to ensure that the public understood the truth, and while it wasn't easy, the momentum was building. But the true test was still ahead. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Jonathan's arrest was only the beginning. There were more people involved in the Kavanaughs' empire of corruption. The network of connections, from law enforcement to local government, would have to be dismantled. The Kavanaughs may have been exposed, but they weren't finished. They had too many resources at their disposal, too many ways to evade justice. Elijah wasn't naive. He knew this battle wouldn't be won quickly. It would take time, effort, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. But there was something inside him now, something he hadn't felt in his hope. The truth had come to light, and no matter how hard the Kavanaughs tried to suppress it, it was out there. The city knew, the world knew, and there was no going back. The next few weeks were filled with legal battles, with Elijah and his allies working tirelessly to ensure that the Kavanaughs couldn't escape their responsibility. Elijah met with reporters, Community leaders and lawyers, all working together to bring down the remaining parts of the Kavanaugh dynasty, as the investigation uncovered more evidence. The full scope of the Kavanaugh's crimes became more apparent, but Elijah wasn't in it for the headlines or the accolades. He was in it for something far deeper. It chanced to rebuild what had been broken. It chanced to restore his name and his dignity. Amanda stayed by his side, helping him navigate the complex legal and emotional journey. The two had grown close over the past months, each finding in the other someone who understood the weight of the world they were carrying. They had seen the worst of humanity, but they had also witnessed incredible acts of courage, of community, of resistance, and now, as they moved forward, Amanda felt something stirring inside her, something that had been dormant for too long, the belief that, together, they could change the world. In the midst of all this, one thing became abundantly clear. The Silver Crest was no longer just a hotel. It had become a symbol of redemption, of the long road to justice, and of the power of resilience for Elijah. It was a way of honoring the man he had once been, a man who dreamed big, a man who built something from nothing. It wasn't just about the hotel anymore. It was about reclaiming his legacy, about showing the world that even when everything is taken from you, you can rise again. But the hardest part was yet to come, as Elijah prepared for the next phase of his legal battle. He found himself staring at the Silver Crest from a distance. The future of the hotel was uncertain. But one thing was clear. Whatever happened next, Elijah would be there, standing tall. The Kavanaughs might have built an empire on deceit, but Elijah Carter would be the one to bring it down. And in doing so, he would change not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone who had ever been wronged by the powerful. The fight for justice wasn't over yet, but the first victory had been won. Elijah Carter was no longer a forgotten man. He was a symbol of hope, a living testament to the power of perseverance and truth. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Elijah Carter wasn't afraid. The Kavanaughs might have tried to break him, but they had underestimated him. Now, he was ready for whatever came next. The days following Jonathan Kavanaugh's arrest were a whirlwind. The Silver Crest Hotel, once a symbol of elitism and power, had transformed into the epicenter of a major public reckoning. The hotel's grand ballroom, which had hosted lavish parties and the city's high society, was now a place of protest and debate. The people who had once been invisible were now speaking out, sharing their stories of how the Kavanaughs had stripped them of their land, businesses, and dreams. Elijah Carter had not only become a symbol of resistance, but a beacon for those who had been silent for far too long. Amanda stood by his side, reflecting on the storm that had passed. She had been integral to their success, gathering the evidence, securing the media coverage, and exposing the Kavanaughs for the frauds they were. But the weight of the victory hadn't fully sunk in yet. There was still so much to do. Jonathan's arrest was just the beginning. But Amanda could sense the need for a shift. She no longer just wanted to bring down the Kavanaughs. She wanted to rebuild, to change the city's very foundation. The Kavanaugh family was reeling, their empire crumbling under the pressure of public scrutiny. Yet, as the legal battles continued, Amanda knew that the Kavanaughs wouldn't go down easily. They still had resources, powerful allies who were trying to protect them. But the tide was turning. The Kavanaughs might have had money, but Elijah had something far more valuable now: the truth. Elijah, Amanda said one evening, as the two sat in his modest apartment, watching news coverage of the ongoing investigation, this isn't just about the Silver Crest anymore, is it? It's about something bigger than that. Elijah, looking out the window at the city skyline, nodded slowly. The lines on his face were deep, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It's about more than just me. It's about everyone the Kavanaughs crushed to build their empire. It's about people like us, people who've been ignored, forgotten, silenced. Amanda could see the transformation in Elijah, the man who had once been defeated by the system, left with nothing but his dignity, was now standing tall, his resolve stronger than ever. It wasn't just the hotel that had been taken from him, it was his life, his future. But Elijah wasn't the kind of man to let that go quietly. He was going to reclaim not only his legacy, but the voices of those who had been denied theirs for too long. I want to rebuild the Silver Crest, Elijah continued, his voice full of conviction, not as a monument to the Kavanaughs, not as a symbol of what they took from me, but as a place that gives back, a place that serves the community, not just the wealthy. Amanda's heart swelled with admiration. She knew that Elijah was no longer just thinking of himself. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice in the traditional sense. It was about creating something that could change lives. A place that would stand as a testament to the resilience of those who had been overlooked for so long. Do you think the city will accept that? Amanda asked. After everything that's happened, after all the years of corruption and pain. Elijah smiled, though there was a hardness in his gaze. They don't have to accept it. The city will have no choice but to change. We'll make sure of it. One step at a time. The next few weeks were filled with meetings, consultations, and legal maneuvering. Elijah worked tirelessly with Carl, Frank, and a team of lawyers to ensure the Kavanaughs would be held accountable not just for the fraud surrounding the Silver Crest, but for their broader exploitation of the city's marginalized communities. They filed lawsuits against the Kavanaugh estate, demanding that the properties they had stolen be returned to their rightful owners. But this wasn't just about winning legal battles, it was about changing the way the city operated. Elijah wanted to ensure that the Kavanaugh's actions were not swept under the rug. During this time, Amanda started to see the bigger picture. She had always seen herself as a small cog in the machine of the Silver Crest Hotel. But now, with Elijah leading the charge, she felt that they were creating something far more significant. It wasn't just a hotel. It was a movement. Amanda began to work on a proposal for a community center to be housed within the Silver Crest space where business owners, especially those from marginalized communities, could come together to share resources, get legal support, and learn how to protect their interests. Frank Banks, too, began documenting everything, each step of the legal battle. The stories of those affected by the Kavanaughs and the people Elijah was helping to rebuild. Frank's articles began to gain traction, his name becoming synonymous with the fight for justice. He wasn't just exposing corruption anymore, he was writing the future of the city, helping to shape a narrative that prioritized the voices of those who had been silenced for far too long. But even as the media coverage continued, there were still those who tried to silence them. The Kavanaugh's legal team worked tirelessly to undermine their efforts, using every tactic in the book to delay the inevitable. They had powerful friends, politicians, and lawyers at their disposal, and they weren't giving up easily. But with each passing day, Elijah's resolve only grew stronger. Every roadblock, every attempt to stop them, only solidified his belief that this was his fight. Not just for him, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. The breakthrough came when a former Kavanaugh employee, Martha Reynolds, came forward with crucial testimony. She had been working for Bennett Kavanaugh back in the 1980s, and she had seen the way Elijah had been betrayed. She had been a quiet witness to the fraudulent transactions, the illegal land seizures, and the deliberate destruction of Elijah's reputation. Martha had been too scared to speak out at the time. But now, with the full weight of the truth coming to light, she was ready to testify. Martha's testimony was a game changer. It confirmed everything that Elijah had suspected, that Bennett Kavanaugh had orchestrated the entire scheme to take Elijah down, to erase him from the history of the Silver Crest. With Martha's help, Elijah was able to expose the Kavanaugh's tactics, and the public outcry was deafening. People who had once been indifferent to Elijah's struggle now saw the full extent of the injustice. The final piece fell into place when the city council voted to investigate the Kavanaugh family's practices. The pressure from the public, the media, and the legal team had become too great for the local government to ignore. The Kavanaughs were facing criminal charges that could lead to the forfeiture of their remaining properties and assets. The Silver Crest was officially in the hands of the city. But there was still one more thing Elijah needed to do, standing in front of the Grand Hotel, now covered in scaffolding for renovations. Elijah addressed a crowd of supporters. The media was present, the cameras rolling, as Elijah spoke of a new future, one where the Silver Crest would not be a monument to the Kavanaugh's corruption, but a place where people of all backgrounds could come together and build something better. "This hotel was stolen from me," Elijah began, his voice clear and strong. "But it's not just about this building. It's about all of us. It's about taking back what was rightfully ours. It's about creating something that gives back to the community, that empowers those who have been overlooked. Together, we will rebuild." The crowd erupted in applause, and Amanda couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. She had never imagined this moment, this journey. But now she knew it was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, but they had won the first battle, and with the city behind them, they would continue to rise. As Elijah turned to look at the Silver Crest, he knew that this was just the beginning. The Kavanaughs had taken everything from him, but they hadn't broken him. And now, with the truth on his side, there was nothing that could stop him from reclaiming his legacy and helping others do the same. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt ready for whatever came next. The future, as uncertain as it was, no longer seemed as daunting. It was filled with possibilities, and Elijah Carter was ready to seize them all. I truly hope you'll subscribe to support us. Your encouragement means a lot, and it helps us bring more stories like this to you. The aftermath of the Silver Crest scandal had left Elijah in a whirlwind of emotions. He had waited decades for this moment, the moment when the truth would be exposed, when justice would finally be served, and when the Kavanaughs would pay for their crimes. But now that the moment had come, Elijah found himself standing at a crossroads. The world had watched the Kavanaugh family crumble, and the hotel, once a symbol of his failure, had become the center of a new battle, one for redemption, for healing, and for his place in a city that had long abandoned him. The legal battles had been long and exhausting, but Elijah had the truth on his side, and now, with the Silver Crest under city control, and the Kavanaughs facing the consequences of their actions, Elijah had to confront the most difficult part of his journey, his own past. Amanda stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his shoulder as they looked up at the Silver Crest, its facade now draped in scaffolding and the hum of construction in the air. The hotel was being transformed, but Elijah couldn't help but think of the years lost to spent in prison for a crime he didn't commit, years spent homeless, his name erased from history. The bitterness still lingered, though the triumph of their victory had dulled its sting. "I never thought I'd see the day," Elijah said, his voice quiet but resolute. "Never thought I'd be standing here, looking at this building, knowing that it's mine again." Amanda watched him closely, her heart aching for the man she had come to know over the past months. Elijah had endured so much, and yet here he was, standing tall, reclaiming the legacy that had been stolen from him. But she knew that the fight for Elijah's true redemption wasn't over yet. The legal victory was one thing, but the emotional scars ran much deeper. Elijah had to confront the anger, the resentment, the pain that had been festering for so many years, and that, Amanda knew, would be the hardest battle of all. "You've done something incredible, Elijah," Amanda said, her voice soft but firm. "But this This is about more than just taking back what was stolen. It's about healing, about finding peace with everything that's happened. Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at her, a mix of gratitude and skepticism in his gaze. Peace. How am I supposed to find peace when I've lost so much? My family, my life. This hotel was everything I worked for, and they took it all from me. Amanda nodded, understanding the depth of his pain. I know, but you've done more than just take back the hotel. You've given a voice to the people who were silenced. You've shown that no matter how far down the system tries to push you, you can rise again. There was a long silence between them as Elijah absorbed her words. He had never been one to dwell on the past for too long, but the weight of everything he had lost still felt like a heavy burden on his shoulders. He had survived. Yes, but survival wasn't the same as living. He had fought for so long. But now, with the Kavanaghs facing their downfall and the Silver Crest poised to become a place of change, Elijah felt a strange sense of emptiness. The road to redemption, it seemed, was long and uncertain. I don't know if I can ever forgive them, Amanda, Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know if I'll ever be able to move past what they did to me, to my family, to so many people. Amanda gently placed a hand on his arm, her touch offering comfort, but also a silent challenge. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Elijah. It doesn't mean excusing what they did. But it's about freeing yourself from the past. It's about taking back your peace. If you don't let go of the anger, it'll continue to weigh you down. You don't owe them that. Elijah turned away from her, his gaze fixed on the hotel as the noise of construction filled the air. The scaffolding was a metaphor. He realized the Silver Crest was being rebuilt, brick by brick, and so was he. The process would take time. He wasn't ready to forgive, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, he could begin to understand that he didn't need to carry the weight of his past forever. As the weeks passed, Elijah's role in the community began to grow. The Silver Crest, now officially under the management of the city and with Elijah at its helm, became a symbol of resilience and transformation. The building itself was being renovated. But it wasn't just the walls and floors being rebuilt. Elijah had been working closely with local community leaders, business owners, and activists to create a space that would offer support to those who had been wronged by the system, people who, like him, had been pushed to the margins. The new Silver Crest would house a community center, a place for education, legal aid, and business development for underserved communities. It would provide resources for those looking to start their own businesses, people who had been excluded from opportunities because of their race, background, or socioeconomic status. Elijah knew that this was the true legacy he wanted to leave, a legacy of empowerment. Not just a hotel. Amanda, too, found herself increasingly involved in the transformation of the Silver Crest. She had been offered a high-paying job at a prestigious corporation after all of this was over, but she couldn't bring herself to take it. Her heart was with Elijah, with the people whose stories she had witnessed, and with the opportunity to help change the world. She had found her purpose in helping those who had been silenced. And she wasn't about to turn her back on it now. As the community center started to take shape within the hotel, Elijah began to feel the weight of the responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. The fight against the Kavanaghs had been a battle for justice. But this was a fight for something even more important. It was a fight for a future where everyone had the opportunity to succeed, to thrive, and to be heard. But even as the Silver Crest was being transformed into a place of opportunity, Elijah was still haunted by the ghosts of his past. The scars were there, deep and raw. And while he had started to heal, there was still so much work to be done. The anger he felt toward the Kavanaghs wasn't something that could be erased overnight, nor was it something he could ignore. But as he sat in the lobby of the Silver Crest one evening, watching the progress of the renovations and the growing sense of hope in the air, he realized something important. The fight for redemption wasn't just about confronting the people who had wronged him. It was about facing himself. He had spent so many years fighting against the world. But now, in this moment of stillness, he knew that the hardest battle of all would be with the man he saw in the mirror. Elijah had to learn how to forgive, not for the Kavanaugh's sake, but for his own. He had to find peace within himself before he could truly move forward, and so, as the Silver Crest's transformation continued, Elijah Carter began the slow, painful process of transforming himself. The road to redemption was long, but he was no longer afraid of it. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He was building something stronger, something better, and as the walls of the Silver Crest were rebuilt, so too were the walls of his own heart, brick by brick, until one day he could look at the building and finally look at himself and say, "I am whole again." Elijah sat quietly in his office, staring out of the window at the construction site outside. The Silver Crest, once the symbol of betrayal and loss, was now a testament to the power of resilience and justice. The renovations were nearly complete, and soon the community center would open its doors, offering resources to those who had been marginalized by the system for so long. This was Elijah's redemption. But as much as he had fought for this moment, there was still a heaviness in his heart, a gnawing feeling that he had not yet fully faced the final piece of his journey. The phone on his desk buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up, his hand steady despite the weight of his own thoughts. It was Amanda. "Elijah, they're coming," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "The city council is about to vote on whether to seize the Kavanaugh assets, including the Silver Crest." Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, the anger rising inside him. The Kavanaughs were still trying to hold on to their power, to maintain their wealth. Even after everything that had come to light, they hadn't fully given up. Jonathan Kavanaugh had already been arrested, but his influence still reached far, and his allies in the city had begun pushing back against the changes Elijah had worked so hard to make. This last attempt to reclaim their stolen assets was the final battle, and Elijah knew that if the Kavanaughs succeeded, it could undo everything he had fought for. "I'll be there," Elijah said, his voice calm despite the fire that burned inside him. When Elijah arrived at the city hall, the atmosphere was tense. The city council chamber was packed with reporters, community members, and political figures, all waiting for the vote that would determine the future of the Silver Crest. Elijah's presence was noted as he walked in. He had become a symbol of resistance, not just for his fight to reclaim the hotel, but for the broader struggle against systemic corruption and inequality. The city had rallied behind him. But this final confrontation would decide whether his victory would stand or if the Kavanaughs would regain their hold. Amanda met him at the back of the room, her face filled with determination. "The vote will take place soon," she said. "The Kavanaughs have been working behind the scenes, using every trick to manipulate the outcome. But we have something they don't: truth and the support of the people." Elijah nodded, his jaw clenched. "They've used money, power, and fear to control everything for far too long. But that ends now. This is for everyone they tried to erase. It's time to make sure the truth stands, no matter what they throw at us." The council session began, and the debate started with both sides making their arguments. The Kavanaugh's lawyers, well-dressed and polished, spoke eloquently, claiming that the Kavanaugh legacy was too important to the city to lose. They argued that the Silver Crest was a vital part of the city's identity and economy, and that it would be a mistake to tear down the family's decades of investment in the community. They painted Elijah as a bitter, vengeful man, seeking revenge on a family that had only ever wanted to contribute to the city's prosperity. But Elijah didn't flinch. He had been painted in many ways over the years criminal, homeless, forgotten, but he knew who he was now. And the people in the room, the people who had supported him from the beginning, knew too. When it was his turn to speak, Elijah stood. His movements steady but filled with purpose. The room went silent, and all eyes were on him as he walked to the front of the chamber. Ladies and gentlemen, Elijah began, his voice strong and clear. For decades, the Kavanaughs have used their wealth and power to crush anyone who stood in their way. They built their empire on stolen dreams and destroyed lives. They erased me from history, but they couldn't erase the truth. The Silver Crest was built on land that belonged to me. It was my vision, my labor, my investment, and for years they have denied me and so many others what is rightfully ours. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The weight of his statement hung in the air. Today, I stand before you not as a man seeking revenge, but as a man seeking justice. Justice for my family, for my people, and for all the families lost everything to the Kavanaughs. We cannot allow this cycle of corruption to continue. The city is better than this. We are better than this. Elijah's gaze swept over the room, his eyes locking with the faces of those who had been on his side. He knew that their fight wasn't just about the Silver Crest anymore. It was about the future of the city, about ensuring that no one could ever use money and power to crush others again. The battle was bigger than just him. It was about rewriting a broken system. Do not let the Kavanaughs' wealth and their influence cloud your judgment today, Elijah continued. They have had their chance. They've had their empire. Now it's time for those who have been silenced, for those who have been oppressed, to have their turn. I ask you to vote for what is right, for what is just, and for what will pave the way for a better future for everyone. The room was still. The council members exchanged glances, and the tension in the air was palpable. It was clear that this was not just a legal battle, it was a moral one. This vote would determine whether the city would continue to be governed by those with money and power, or whether it would be a place where justice, truth, and equality could thrive. The final votes were cast, and the results were announced. The city council had voted in favor of transferring the Silver Crest to public ownership, ensuring that it would be used for the benefit of the community, and not as a monument to the Kavanaughs' corruption. The victory was complete. Elijah had won. A wave of relief swept over him, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The battle for the Silver Crest was over, but there was still so much more to do. Elijah wasn't just reclaiming a building. He was helping to reshape the future of the city, to make sure that power was not concentrated in the hands of a few, but was shared by many. Later that evening, after the council meeting had ended, Elijah stood alone outside the Silver Crest, looking at the building in the dimming light. The scaffolding was still up, but the structure was beginning to take shape. The process of rebuilding was long, but Elijah felt a sense of peace wash over him. The building was more than just stone and brick now. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for. Amanda approached quietly, standing next to him. "You did it," she said softly, her voice filled with admiration. "You really did it." Elijah looked at her, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We did it, all of us." Amanda smiled back, her heart swelling with pride. The city was changing, and so was Elijah. The road had been long, but it had led them here to a new beginning. As they stood together, looking at the Silver Crest, Elijah knew that this wasn't the end. It was the start of something bigger, something more meaningful. The Kavanaughs had been defeated, but their legacy of injustice still lingered. Elijah had faced down the past and, in doing so, had reclaimed not just his legacy, but the future of the city itself. The future was still uncertain, but Elijah was no longer afraid. He had fought for the truth, and the truth had set him free. He had reclaimed not just the Silver Crest, but his place in the world, and with Amanda by his side. He knew that the journey ahead would be one of hope, of healing, and of transformation together. They would make sure that the past would never repeat itself, and that the future would be a place where justice and fairness reigned for everyone. Months passed since the city council's historic vote, and the Silver Crest Hotel was gradually transformed, its historical significance slowly evolving into a new symbol for the city, one of hope, resilience, and rebirth. The scaffolding had been taken down. The once tarnished facade now gleamed under the bright lights of the city. Inside, the community center had become a hub of activity, hosting programs for business owners, legal aid for disenfranchised families, and community-driven events that breathed new life into the heart of the city. The Silver Crest was no longer a monument to corruption, but a beacon of hope. But Elijah Carter, despite the obvious transformation around him, found himself in deep contemplation. His life had changed so dramatically, yet some parts of his past still lingered. There were days when the weight of the years of injustice pressed down on him, and though the hotel was finally his again, he knew the emotional battle was far from over. It wasn't enough to have the building, it was about what it would become and how the history of the city, his history, would be remembered. Amanda had been by his side throughout the entire process, watching him grow not only as a leader, but as a man finding his peace. She had seen him struggle with anger, resentment, and confusion as he pieced together the broken fragments of his life, but she had also witnessed his quiet transformation. The slow and deliberate effort to forgive not just the Kavanaughs, but himself. She knew he wasn't yet fully there. But Elijah had come a long way from the angry man who had once walked into that hotel lobby with nothing but a sack and a point to prove. As Elijah walked through the hallways of the Silver Crest one quiet evening, he could hear the hum of activity in the community center. It was bustling with energy, people coming together, working on their dreams, helping one another. His legacy was no longer just about reclaiming what was taken from him. It was about ensuring that the same injustice would never happen again. Not to him, and not to anyone else. His steps echoed on the marble floor as he moved toward the old, grand ballroom that had seen so much history, both painful and triumphant. The ballroom was now set to host a series of important events, gatherings for city leaders, cultural programs, and even art exhibitions that celebrated the diverse communities that had once been silenced. But as Elijah stood before the room's large windows, looking out at the city he had fought so hard for, he couldn't shake the quiet doubt that crept into his mind. What if this wasn't enough? What if his fight had been just a small ripple in a much larger ocean of corruption? He had faced a monumental battle, and the Kavanaughs had been knocked down. But Elijah understood that one battle didn't change everything. The system that had allowed the Kavanaughs to thrive for generations wasn't just about one family. It was about a deep-rooted inequality that existed in the city, and in so many other places. But Elijah also knew that if change was ever going to happen, it had to start somewhere, and it had to start with people like him, ordinary people who had the courage to stand up and say, enough. Amanda found him there, standing by the window. She had always known when he needed space to think, but she also knew when it was time to step in. "You've built something incredible here," she said softly, her eyes meeting his as she approached him. "This place, the people we're helping, everything we've done, it's all because of you. This is your legacy." Elijah turned to her, the familiar warmth in his eyes, but there was still a weariness in his voice. "It doesn't feel like enough, Amanda. There's so much more to fix, so much more to change." The Kavanaughs were just one part of it. What about the others, the people still struggling? Amanda smiled gently, understanding the depth of his concerns. "You know, this isn't just about the Kavanaughs anymore, right? This is bigger than that. You've made sure that their empire of lies is dismantled. But you've also created something that people can rely on. Something that helps them rebuild. People are already seeing the change. Elijah. And it's all because you stood up? Elijah nodded slowly. He had never imagined that the fight would be easy. But there were days when he found it difficult to believe that his efforts would make a lasting impact. He thought of the faces of the people who had come to the community center, the business owners who now had a chance to turn their dreams into reality, the families who no longer had to live in fear of losing their homes. It wasn't just a hotel anymore. It was a place where dreams could be reborn, where futures could be rewritten. But Elijah also understood that the battle for equity and justice didn't end with the community center. It was about continuing to raise the voices of the voiceless, to ensure that the corrupt practices that had defined the Kavanaughs and their allies were rooted out and never allowed to take hold again. He couldn't change everything in one lifetime, but he could make sure the next generation had a better chance at building a just world. "Do you ever wonder if it was worth it?" Elijah asked Amanda, the vulnerability in his voice momentarily breaking through his steadfast resolve. "All those years fighting, losing everything. Was it worth it?" Amanda's gaze softened as she walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. "It's easy to look back and ask if it was worth it. But what you've built here, what you've done for the community, it's worth everything. The pain, the struggle. They led you to this moment, and because of that, you've created something that will change lives. It's already changing them." Elijah allowed her words to sink in, realizing that his own journey had become a beacon for others to follow. He had once been a man broken by a corrupt system, and now he was a symbol of defiance, of strength, of transformation. He wasn't just a man who had reclaimed a hotel. He was a man who had reclaimed his dignity, his sense of purpose, and his place in the world. "I've spent so many years thinking of what was taken from me," Elijah said, his voice steadying with conviction. "But now, I realize it's not just about what was lost. It's about what we can build. Together, it's about leaving something better than we found it. And that's what I'm going to do." Amanda smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "And you are." The silver crest stood behind them, no longer a shadow of Elijah's past, but a representation of the future he had fought for. It was more than a hotel. It was a community, a home, and a symbol of what could happen when people stood up and demanded justice. Elijah had reclaimed his place, not just in history, but in the hearts of everyone who had suffered under the weight of oppression. As the sun set over the city, Elijah and Amanda stood together, ready to face whatever came next. They knew the road ahead would still be challenging, that the fight for justice and equality would never be truly over. But for the first time in a long time, Elijah could look out at the city and feel peace. His journey had come full circle, not with the end of a battle, but with the beginning of something much bigger. The story of the Silver Crest had yet to be fully written, but with each new day, it became more and more a story of hope, of redemption, and of the power of the human spirit. And with that, Elijah was ready to move forward, knowing that the legacy he was building would last far longer than any of the battles he had fought. The following months were filled with both victories and challenges, but Elijah Carter had long since grown accustomed to the difficulty of the road ahead. Each step he took in rebuilding the Silver Crest, each new initiative launched within the community center, and every individual who walked through its doors seeking help and hope only reinforced the fact that he had chosen the right path. The Silver Crest wasn't just a building anymore, it was a testament to the power of resilience, a reminder that even after years of pain, there could still be a new beginning. Elijah spent his days walking through the community center, meeting with local business owners, offering guidance to those who sought to rebuild their lives and, at times, times, offering a quiet word of encouragement to the staff who had joined him in his mission. Each person who passed through the doors reminded him of why he had fought so hard and what he was fighting for. Justice for those whose voices had been silenced for far too long. Amanda, as always, was right by his side, her unwavering support a constant pillar in the storm that often surrounded them. Her dedication to the cause had never faltered, even when the world around them seemed chaotic, even when Elijah had moments of doubt. The partnership they had forged in the fire of their shared struggle had only grown stronger. She had found her place in the mission to not just as an ally, but as someone deeply committed to the community and the transformation they were working toward. Elijah. Amanda called out one afternoon, her voice cutting through the buzz of activity in the center. She waved to him as she entered the room, a document in her hand. "You're not going to believe this." Elijah looked up from the conversation he was having with a group of local entrepreneurs and raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "It's a letter from the city," Amanda said, her voice brimming with excitement. "They've approved the proposal to create a fund dedicated to supporting small businesses in historically underserved neighborhoods. They are taking some of the proceeds from the Silver Crests events and putting it toward economic development initiatives. Guess who they want to spearhead it?" Elijah's eyes widened. "They want me?" "Yes," Amanda said, her smile widening. "They want you to be the lead advisor on this. They're essentially giving you control over how this fund will be used and which initiatives it will support." Elijah stared at the letter in disbelief. He had fought so hard for the city to recognize the importance of supporting marginalized communities, and now he had a chance to help others in a way that was far greater than he had ever imagined. This was a huge moment for him, not just personally, but for the future of the city. He had always believed that true change came from empowering people to create their own futures. And now he had the means to make that happen. This is incredible," Elijah murmured, taking the letter from Amanda's hand. He couldn't help but feel a rush of pride in that moment. His journey had been long and difficult, but this was a victory that felt like it could change everything. "It's the next step," Amanda said, her eyes bright, "and it's exactly what this city needs. You've already done so much, but this will make sure that your work continues and expands. You've got the city's attention now." "Elijah," they're listening. Elijah's mind began to race with possibilities. The fund could support so much: small business grants, mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs, educational initiatives for underserved communities. It could be a game changer for the people who had been denied opportunity for so long. But with that opportunity came responsibility, and Elijah knew that the weight of it wasn't something he could take lightly. This fund could become a model for other cities, a way to show that real change was possible, even in systems that had long been broken. "We'll need to move quickly," Elijah said, determination flooding his voice. "We need to make sure the fund is managed with transparency, that it's not just going to line the pockets of the rich or get misused in some way. We've already seen how easily power can corrupt." Amanda nodded in agreement. "But we've got a good team. The city trusts you, and we've got the community behind us. We'll make sure it's done right." Over the next few months, Elijah worked tirelessly with city officials, local leaders, and business owners to ensure that the fund was established with integrity and purpose. The work was difficult, but it was rewarding, watching local entrepreneurs thrive, seeing new businesses open, and knowing that they were all benefiting from a system designed to help them succeed filled Elijah with a sense of accomplishment that he had never felt before. But even with the success of the fund, Elijah couldn't fully shake the shadow of the past. He had finally reclaimed the Silver Crest, and the community center was flourishing. But deep down, he knew that the real challenge was to create lasting change. It wasn't enough to simply take back what had been stolen. It was about creating a city that worked for everyone. A city where power wasn't concentrated in the hands of a few, but shared among all its people. One day, after a particularly long meeting about the fund's future, Elijah found himself back at the Silver Crest, standing alone in the lobby. The renovations were complete now, and the hotel was buzzing with activity. People came and went. Tourists stayed in the luxurious rooms, and local families visited the community center, where workshops and events had become a regular part of life. But as he stood there, watching the bustle of the hotel, Elijah couldn't help but think of what this place had once represented: the Kavanaugh's empire, the system of oppression that had sought to erase him. Now, it was his vision, his dream, and the people's space. He had rebuilt it from the ground up, not just physically, but metaphorically. As Elijah walked through the halls, his footsteps echoing softly, he realized that the battle was still far from over. The Kavanaughs had been defeated, but there would always be more battles to fight, more injustices to right. The work wasn't about a single victory, it was about building something that would last. Something that would give future generations the tools they needed to succeed without facing the same roadblocks Elijah had faced. Just as he was about to leave, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Amanda walking toward him, her eyes warm with understanding. "You're thinking about the future, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with certainty. Elijah nodded slowly. "It's just so much work to do, so much more we can do. We'll do it," Amanda said, her smile unwavering. "One step at a time, together." And just like that, Elijah knew. The fight wasn't over. The journey was long, but it was worth it. The Silver Crest, his life, the people they had helped, it was all part of something bigger. He wasn't just rebuilding a hotel. He was rebuilding a future. One where hope, justice, and equality weren't just dreams, they were reality. With Amanda by his side, Elijah looked out at the horizon. He wasn't afraid anymore. Together, they had begun something that could change everything. The city would be different, and so would the world. And that was just the beginning. The future was his, and it was bright. If you believe in the power of truth, please share this video with friends and family. Hit the like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Do you want to hear part 2? Let us know. And stay tuned for more.